Hello folks, I'm Rupert Soskin.
And I'm Michael Bott. We're the Prehistory Guys, and welcome to another Calanais conversation. Today we're talking with Sue Clutterbuck and Peter Vallance, who have spent many years involved with the archaeology and mythology surrounding Calanais.
It's widely known that the late Margaret Curtis devoted much of her life to researching and understanding the intricacies of the Calanais complex. And over a 20-year period, Sue and Peter worked alongside her, recording interviews and making a number of films of the lunar standstill at Sites 1 and 3.
The value of their work in recording Margaret's knowledge and research cannot be understated, and they came along to tell us a bit about it.
Peter, Sue, welcome to Calanais Conversations. It's lovely. Thanks ever so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. I'm just going to kick straight off and ask you, just tell us about yourselves and how are you connected with Calanais in the first place?
Yep. So, Peter Vallance, my name. My mother's family were Sandersons from Shetland. And I remember my granddad, he was a sailor, went all around the world. But he was born and brought up in Calanais House in Unst. The tradition of people in the island would go to a particular house to hear the stories, and went up to Shetland and met people who are, talking about remembering my great grandmother telling stories, smoking her pipe, and then realized, of course, they hadn't been there. They'd heard these stories from their parents, who'd heard it from their parents. And so this passing on of stories, something that became of great interest to me in my family. And then it was many years before I was talking about this with my dad, and he was saying, "Oh yes, when Hamish Henderson was round and we had the Cayleys in the hall." I was like, you knew Hamish, who of course, is well known for recording the Scottish Travellers, particularly Jeanie Robertson. And so this kind of family legacy of storytelling became of more interest to me when I went to college, studied theatre and dance, and then began going round, as I had with my parents and my brother, seeing the landscape of Scotland and becoming interested in the stories of it. So that's my background. Oh yes, and then at a certain point, I ended up at the Findhorn community in the 80s, where in the early 2000s I met Sue.
Yes. Um, so I'm Sue Clutterbuck. My background actually is mostly in education. I was a primary school teacher like Margaret, and have a university teaching background as a researcher as well. And Margaret and I both shared a love of sharing information and knowledge with other people of all generations in a way that included them and in a way that encouraged and invited them to find out more. And this is one of my connections with Calanais. So I came to the Findhorn community in 2002 and met up with Peter, who at that time was doing a lot of tours to prehistoric sites, both in Ireland and in Scotland. And I joined his tours and became involved with them. And we took a number of tours up to Lewis, and there I met Margaret. So that was the direct connection with Margaret and Calanais. And from then on, she almost adopted me, if you like, as either a smaller sister or a daughter, because that was kind of like, it felt like the relationship that I had with her. And for the next 20 years, I followed her across peat and moorland and hillside and all sorts of different terrains to support her work, and worked with Peter to film her. So that was our connection with Calanais, really. And I love the Stones as well.
Excellent. Tell us more about Margaret and what actually specific work did you do with Margaret Curtis?
Yeah, so in the 90s, late 90s, when I did the first tour to Calanais, a friend of mine said, you're going to Calanais. You must book a tour with Margaret. So I rang her up and booked a day tour for this group that I was taking, not having any idea how it was going to work. And so turned up at Margaret's little cottage in Calanais village. Ron was still alive then. And uh, if if we look at the first photograph now of Margaret taking one of these tours round, she had this rucksack full of pictures which were on wooden boards. So the rucksack was quite heavy, really, because she'd got sticky back plastic and everything, so that as you went round on the tour, she'd have all these photographs showing you what you would see with the moon, if the weather was good, because of course a lot of the time you couldn't see the hills in the distance
Yeah.
and things because of the weather on Calanais. So Margaret always started her tour at the cottage, and she had this Spanish windlass where she'd demonstrate how people would move stones over uneven ground. Um, and so she'd get people involved straight away, tying knots and lifting things and moving things. So it was very interactive what Margaret did, very engaging.
Mm,
And
mm,
then
mm.
she had in her exhibition these little trays of sand, and she would build stone circles, circles, flattened circles, and elliptical circles, the three main kinds of circles you get in the UK. And again, getting people to put the stones into the sand and seeing how it was all constructed. And she'd do this before we'd go out to see the sights. Um, and then you'll see in this picture, Sue and I, this must be early 2000s, traveling around the various sites with Margaret. And at this particular time in this photograph, we're near the range of hills that are referred to as Calanais na Muncha. And I should say in the Gaelic, so we are not native Gaelic speakers. So Calanais na Muncha, the exact pronunciation, you should talk to somebody from Lewis. Um,
Yes.
so the range of hills in English, often referred to as Sleeping Beauty,
Uh,
nobody really knows. Well, I don't know how this evolved from Calanais na Muncha, which means the old woman of the moors. But it is interesting if you look at the old stories of the Calanais Beara, as she's referred to in Scotland, or the Calanais Beara, as she's referred to in Ireland, which are also related to the stories of Bride, Breed in Scots Gaelic, Bridget in the Irish, the Maiden and the Crone. And I'd become interested in these stories earlier in life through the traditions of Scotland, and then meeting Margaret. And uh, one of the things Margaret did was that as an archaeologist, she'd tour people round the stones, and then the people she met would go, "Oh, well, that's interesting." People perhaps with the second sight or whatever, people who had an intuition, they'd share their stories of what they felt or saw with Margaret. And then Margaret would pass these stories on, of course, saying, as an archaeologist, I really couldn't comment. But over the years, the people who kind of gathered around Margaret, forming a community, kind of
yeah.
evolved this more mythological knowledge of the landscape that was connected in with the archaeology. And in particular, at the sites at Calanais referred to as numbers. So at site 3, Margaret was showing people the circle once, and she said, it is strange that within this circle there are 4 other stones. One quite phallic and male-like, and then 3 other stones with it. And one of the people on Margaret's tour many years ago said, "Well, of course, Margaret, you realize what you've got here within the circle. And Margaret's like, well, no. That's obviously a representation of the triple goddess, the Virgin, the Mother, and Crone, together with the male consort. So if you look at the three stones, one is not really white, it's more grey, but it's triangular, and so associated in mythology with the Virgin. The Mother Stone within the circle, which at sunset really does glow red, and it clearly has breasts. And then the Calanais stone, the Crone stone, more grey and weathered. And then the male stone, which very interestingly has a vein of quartz running through it, and quartz in the Scots Gaelic meaning sunstone, Grian Clach, Grian Cloch in the Irish. And the tradition around quartz, of course, at Newgrange, uh, the whole cairn is, covered in quartz. And Margaret, always in her workshop, would rub two quartz stones together in the dark, showing the luminescence when you rub quartz together. And this idea of the quartz, the light in the darkness, the moon, everything connected with the stones.
Well, it's a very good portrait. It's a very good. I mean, that really gives us a flavour, of what Margaret was up to and her character even. So, but what what was your involvement with all that? What was the actual work that you did with her?
I think it's important to thread into the story of our work with Margaret, that the beginning and the progression of her thinking, um, moving from straight archaeology, and focusing on a particular stone circle or a monument or a site area, to taking on board the ideas of Professor Tom, both Alex and Archie Tom, introduced Margaret more and more to archaeoastronomy. And that was actually a very significant and important thing for her in her work. And it began to influence her understanding more of how the early peoples created different astronomical and celestial alignments that were aligned quite specifically with certain points in the land, which they then built and erected stones and cairns and included in their social ritual and other daily lives and practices. And part of this was the understanding of how they used the wider landscape, if you like, to create a kind of a sort of theatre of understanding about the different celestial powers and energies, and not just the archaeology and the digging into the ground and yes, the stones are this and this their shape and whatever. So I think it's actually important because Margaret wrote a number of publications, um, and you probably know about those. But in one of them, there is a very interesting definition about archaeoastronomy, and it actually encapsulates how Margaret's thinking moved and how it actually changed her work. And it deliberately says that this is a multidisciplinary study of the astronomy practiced by peoples in prehistoric times, which includes the study of standing stones, burial structures, cup and ring carvings, but also folklore, legends, mythology, ethnology, and similar subjects. And so we were I witnessed part of this change of direction in Margaret, and shared that with her. And I found that very interesting.
Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? Obviously, the thing that people most associate with Calanais is the lunar standstill every 18.6 years. You've filmed it more than once, haven't you? I think you were certainly there in 2006.
Yes. So leading up to 2006. So with the standstill, one thing that people don't realize is that essentially you can view it all year. And from the spring equinox, you view the half moon, which is waxing at that point, very low over the stones. At midsummer, the full moon, close to the solstice, will be visible very low. And then by the equinox, it's the waning moon, a half moon. So you've essentially got 6 months to view the moon. So Sue and we went over to visit Margaret and Ron with a group in May. 3 days of torrential rain and no visibility at all. Because also with the standstill, you essentially have 3 days to view it. One day when the moon's coming down, one day when it's at the standstill, and one day when it's going back up again. So we went over for the solstice. And of course, at the solstice, people gather at the stones anyway. And it so happened that in 2006, the standstill was very close to the solstice. This year, it wasn't. And so there were loads of people turned up, all at Site 1, because that's the place to be. So Margaret and Ron had worked out that actually to watch the moon rise, Site 3 was much more interesting. So we went over to Site 3, and if I show you this sequence of photos, the full moon, of course, rises as the sun sets, but because of the hills, it rises much later than you would expect at Site 3. And so we were there at Site 3 waiting for the moon to rise, and the clouds there were clouds, and we weren't at all sure we were going to see anything. And it got later and later, and we were thinking it's not going to show. Because often at Calanais, although it's completely clear, at the horizon, it's completely cloudy.
And we've been out all day with Margaret across all over the place, and we got soaked to the skin. And so we were sitting down to a nice hot dinner.
No, not yet.
Later.
Later. Yeah. So you'll see here the moon has actually risen, and it's just a little glimmer appearing at the feet of Cailleach na Muncha, and just to the left of the stone circle. And then the moon came out completely, and it really was stunning to see the moon just moving low over the Cailleach. And then the stones that I mentioned, you see here, the moon is just touching the triangular stone that we refer to as the Maiden or Virgin. And the fact that you see the stones and the moon just touching them, and then it just so happens from the little viewing circle that we looked at earlier, that the full moon completely kind of touches, is fertilized, if you like, by the male stone. And we really didn't know that this was, going to happen so exactly, so precisely. So that was tremendously exciting. And Ron, Margaret, Sue, and we were the only people there. At Site 3. So, these photographs are unique. And in fact, I never saw Ron's photos. He was always working with transparencies, and, they must be somewhere. But how they came out, I never saw. So then, having seen the moon at Site 3, we went over to Site 1 to watch the moon set, and the clouds came in, and we saw nothing. So then
It's
Uh,
Lewis weather for you.
yeah,
That's it.
July was a washout, August was a washout,
Yeah.
and then September the weather was looking really bad. But we went over anyway for a week just to see how things would be. And so
Checked in with Margaret and Ron.
yeah,
Yes.
and so this is when we went out visiting a few of the lesser known sites. Some of the sites where there's no stones standing at all. That's when we got completely soaked, and
Yes.
then went up to site one well, went up to site one, to see if the moon was going to rise. It was the half waning moon, no moon at all. Quite a number of people around. 20 or 30 or so. Dreadful weather, midges, and no sign of the moon rise. And so by round about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, it was so dreich, everybody was just going home. So we went home for dinner, had dinner, just waiting for dessert. We were down at Loch Rogue, looked out the window, small patch of blue sky, nowhere near the horizon, but clearing quite rapidly. So
Literally, we threw the dessert down on the table, threw
no,
everything into the car, and
I
rushed up the site
didn't
because
even
that's what you have to do.
didn't even get dessert. It was that important. So anyway, so got up to the main site, and people you could see were starting driving in from all over because other people had noticed. But it still wasn't clear on the horizon. Um, and then people were up on Knock Tursa, just kind of scanning the horizon, trying to see the moon. And then suddenly, skies cleared even more, and the moon was visible, just starting to descend. Um, and here was the thing: if you look at the photos, you see that there's lots of people up on the hill in the stones, and the viewing point for site one is the large stone at the end of the avenue, which interestingly has a kind of half moon shape in it. And so there was a few people, probably 6 or 7, Margaret, Ron, and I with our cameras at the back site. But unfortunately, quite a number of people in the circle blocking the view of the moon.
Because people didn't understand that actually you need to view the moon from the backside to look through the circle to see the moon on the horizon. And so people were actually in the circle looking to see the moon at that point. The alignments and the use of back sights are really important, but unless you understand them, people miss the point completely.
Yeah.
So
somebody, of course, was standing at the base of the tallest stone in the circle, completely blocking what everybody had been waiting 18.6 years to see. So Margaret said to me, "Peter, you're going to have to go up there and get them to move." I'm like, "Thanks very much, Margaret." So I went up to the circle, and of course, you can't just approach people who are communing with the moon in the circle and say, "You're ruining our picture. Would you mind moving, please?" So I was like, yes, you're standing there at the base of the great stone, and many people think, of course, this is the most important energetic point in the circle, which, of course, it is to an extent because of the flattened circle. The middle of the circle isn't the stone, it's the gap where the moon is going to become visible. So then, to my eternal shame, I lied to this person and said to her, you know, although obviously this energetic point in front of the stone is important, if you were at the side of the stone, you would be seeing the moon full on, and the moon's energy would be flowing through your heart into the stone. Therefore, you would experience union with the stone.
Such a bad man, Peter. You're a bad man.
To be fair, I don't think I was actually quite that verbose in my explanation, because I didn't have long to get her out of the way. But anyway, she did move round to the side of the stone, so that we could see
You see the moon.
the moon coming into the gap. But we were able to see enough of the moon that we felt satisfied. But yes, I've always wondered if this person actually knew how much of a disaster she nearly created for photographic history.
Yeah. I
Peter, that's a wonderful evocation of being there at the standstill.
Yeah, the lovely thing for me is that, okay, archaeology might be a science, archaeastronomy, there might be a certain amount of science in there, but you know what? When it actually gets to ground zero, you're not in control. And, you know, it's you and the elements, and it's the weather that decides whether or not you will see the moon, whether or not it's going to be revealed to you. And to some extent, for me, that is a little bit about the magic of the moment. And, you know, the actual cycle of 18 years means that you wait for this moment, you have a window of opportunity, but hey, even then, you may not be allowed or given permission by whatever it is that helps to reveal the moon in all her glory or the sun, and you really are not in control. So it's about forgetting human chronological time. It's about forgetting all of your human expectations and entitlement. You're there with the raw elements, you're in the landscape. And actually, for me, I'm standing beside my ancestors in that.
Yeah.
And that raw experience is something that needs to be experienced to be felt and understood as something much more than us small human beings, because that's what it is.
Sue and Peter, between the two of you, you've painted a wonderful picture there, which is quite unique from your first-hand experience. One last question or query, before we wind our chat up. I mean, it's obvious over all this time you got to know Margaret Curtis pretty well. What does her work actually mean to you? How would you like her to be remembered as this important association with the site of Calanais?
My education background kicks in here, because Margaret documented all of her work very carefully, very precisely, and she used a huge amount of experience in formulating a collection of data and research and information, a body of knowledge which she knew that people could access and which she could pass on. And she also knew that a lot of dense text in academic terms, which is sometimes the way that archaeological books and other papers are written, is actually way above a lot of people's understanding. And that actually what people often needed and how they learnt was through visual images. So you will see a number of her books, her publications have photos in them, which, very clearly and very carefully invite you in, to explore and find out more about the topic of Calanais and the Calanais complex, much more than a very heavy, dense archaeological text. So for me, one of the legacies of her work was that she was able to disseminate a lot of information in such a way that it encouraged and invited people to feel included. And she was always very humble. It wasn't as if she stood in the middle of a stone circle and said, I'm the expert here, and you're going to listen to me, and this is what I'm going to tell you. It was an approach that included people. It was an approach that invited them and helped them to feel as if they were part of the mystery and part of the knowledge and experience. She was Calanais. She was the public face of Calanais. And she introduced Calanais to thousands of people from all over the globe who came to see the site long before it became famous. And one of the aspects of her legacy was very much the ability to be able to. She would always very politely ask people to move, for example, if she wanted a photo shot. She wouldn't go up to them and say, "Hey, you, move. I'm the expert. I need to do my work here." There was nothing like that. But Margaret was also very personable. She was always at the people level. She always took care of her appearance. She minded about how she looked. She loved being taken to tea. She loved dressing up. She was always aware of all sorts of different human elements in this story, which is particularly Margaret's story. And that's very much a part of her that I will take, moving on. But the last thing I want to say about Margaret was that at the end of one of her last editions, she very clearly states that both she and Ron, at the end of all of their work, were convinced that Calanais should become a World Heritage Site. And that is something that would really, for me, affirm 30 or more years of her life's work. And I'm hoping that will happen.
Super.
Fantastic.
Super. Well, Sue, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us. And it really is, it's such a different perspective as well for everybody, for all the other Calanais conversations that we had. This is something quite different. So thank you again. And yeah, hope the viewers enjoyed this one as well. Take good care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Bye now.
Bye.